Okay, well, thanks very much for having time to do this, Arpan. Appreciate
Sure.
it. So basically we're talking about Sandbox Solutions today.
Great.
So I'm just going to quickly run around the chairs. So Paul, if you'd like just to introduce yourself in terms of where you're from and what you do.
Sure. Paul Swider from Charleston, South Carolina. I'm an independent consultant and trainer, SharePoint trainer.
I'm Todd Bleeker from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I've been working with SharePoint since before it was called SharePoint. Long time.
Tahoe. Well, no, before
Even
Tahoe.
before that, yeah. Office Web Components.
Site
That's
server.
right. Site server.
Sure.
My name's Arpan Shah. I'm a director on the SharePoint product management team. I work out of Redmond, and sometimes I feel like I work for Todd. So.
So I'm Jeremy Thate, founder of the DevWiki based in Perth, Western Australia.
And I'm Mark Rhodes. I work for OBS as an infrastructure consultant out of Brisbane, Australia.
Cool. So I guess to start with, really wanted to get you to try and explain in a few paragraphs around what Sandbox Solutions is to you, just so that anyone who's listening to this kind of has a bit of an intro straight away before we jump in.
So Sandbox Solution is a new feature in SharePoint 2010, and the idea is that you can actually host solutions in a multi-tenanted way. So the idea came about from SharePoint Online. That's one of our big hosted offerings for SharePoint. And people want to be able to extend SharePoint in a very custom way, outside of SPD, outside of configuration, outside of just declarative ways. And if you think about having a big multi-tenant environment where you have different tenants and people using SharePoint in different ways, you need a safe way to upload code, manage it, and run it.
Yep.
And that's what a sandbox does.
Okay.
So the sandbox basically allows you to upload a solution at a site collection level, activate it, and then manage it without impacting the rest of your farm.
Yep. Yeah, that's a pretty good, concise way of describing that one. And so you talked about kind of the cloud. Do you perceive this being used on premise as well for customers?
Absolutely. If you take a look at SharePoint Online, that is our hosted offering.
Yeah.
But many enterprises, big enterprises, even small ones,
Yeah.
behave like a hoster.
Yeah.
So they're offering SharePoint as a service to their business units. And with Sandbox Solutions, they can offer the service, and then they can be confident that any customizations that are uploaded into that sandbox can run safely without impacting their environment.
Yeah. I know, obviously, with Mark, with the work he does around infrastructure space, have you found that was a major requirement for your customers? Or?
Oh, absolutely. As I have a background in hosting, I've worked for 3 different hosting companies over the last 6 years. And just the progress that the SharePoint team has made towards bringing SharePoint into a multi-tenant space is incredible. And I'd say Sandbox Solutions is the biggest step forward out of all of those, except with perhaps service application partitioning, but I'd say this is the biggest one.
Yeah, okay. And Paul, have you come across any yet in terms of with your customer base actually demanding that you go the Sandbox solution route, or?
Well, I wouldn't say demanding, but when they're presented with the new technology in SharePoint, they're excited about it. Certain clients, right? So the larger clients where they are deploying SharePoint as services, where they almost have SLAs to the different groups within the organization, and also groups and organizations where security is a must.
Yeah.
So there are many organizations where security is just of utmost importance. And so there is no touching the servers, getting to the servers.
Yeah.
Use of even tools like SharePoint Designer is very, very limited.
Right.
And so these are people that are just extremely bright people that have been in the past forced to jump through many hoops to get the functionality that they need out of the sites and the site collections. And so now having this as an option for those types of companies is a benefit.
Yeah. Okay. And Todd, when we were at the conference in Vegas last year, one of the key things that all of the Microsoft representatives and the MVPs were doing was saying that start your Visual Studio projects as a sandbox solution. How have you found that now? That was November, and we're now halfway through this year. Have you found that that's still the same messaging that you'd be providing?
I always start my Visual Studio projects as a sandbox solution.
Yep.
Because if you start with a sandbox solution and you can keep it that way,
yep,
then you've got the option of deploying it into a site collection, or you can choose to deploy it as a farm solution if you need to, right? So it's your choice that way. Whereas if you start with a farm solution straight away, you're kind of just saying, look, I'm not even going to try to deploy this into a site collection solution gallery.
Yeah.
But if you if you need a farm solution, Sandbox solution can be deployed in that context. So there's no reason not to make it sandboxed if you can.
Okay. And I guess to talk around some of the things that are restrictive in the sandbox solutions and developer, what are the key things you're seeing which are stumbling blocks to start with?
Yeah, it is a sandbox, right? So you can't do everything, but things like calling web service, you'll have to do that from JavaScript or something like that, right? Many of the limitations that we have are because we're accustomed to deploying to the file system.
Yeah.
And yes, there's definitely some advantages to deploying to the file system when you need like a very efficient or performant application that you know is going to cache things well in the browser and those kinds of things.
Yep.
However, if what you're looking for is a ubiquitous deployment mechanism that end users themselves can control in order to make them self-sufficient, self-reliant, right, then deploying those things via a cab that they themselves can upload and activate without contacting your IT department is huge. And it's worth having the image in the content database instead of on the file system, or the CSS file, or the JavaScript file, or whatever it is you're trying to put into that context.
And Arpan, have you found with the ISVs, obviously there's a lot of there's going to be a lot of demand for those guys to provide sandbox solutions now because
Sure.
the user base will be aware of that.
Sure.
How have you found the adoption of that so far? Obviously in Vegas it was all very new and people weren't talking about what they were releasing for 2.10 at that point, but just getting to the point now, we had their release date yesterday. The vendors are going to start rolling things out, so there are many ISVs that will be deploying these things.
I think it comes back to what Todd said. I think a lot of people are going to try to do it
Yeah.
as a sandbox solution. I think it's a great way to drive deployment and to drive choice for organizations.
Yep.
So departmental folks that actually use SharePoint as a service can actually deploy it and manage it themselves. There are limitations.
Yep.
So what I don't think ISVs will do is automatically take the code they have and try to fit it into a sandbox.
Yep.
Instead, I think a lot of ISVs will take a look at seeing how they can develop a solution that's made for the sandbox, given the limitations.
Yeah.
One of the other limitations that Todd didn't bring up is, for example, you have a restricted object model as well.
Yep.
So you can't do everything, but you can do quite a bit. I mean,
So
you can
one
access.
of the ones I think it was Ray mentioned was the email was a common one that he found was quite painful because you can't do that within a sandbox solution.
Yeah, and there are limitations. Some of them are by design
Yeah.
because you want it to be partially trusted. Like otherwise, it wouldn't be a sandbox if you could call all
Anything.
these different services
Right.
and do whatever you want.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that. So again, I think ISVs are very excited about the value proposition that it
Yep.
provides. Boy, it's a zero deployment solution. If you
'Cause
do
I
a
guess-
sandbox
yeah.
solution, it's zero deployment.
Yeah, and I guess there's twofold in terms of the limitations. One is from what functions you can do, but the other one is really if it's throwing heaps of exceptions or if it's consuming the CPU.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And so there's two areas. And one of the questions was, well, with the resource points, you can go, well, rather than it being the default, and I forget the figures now, it's like 50 exceptions, we'll make it so this site collection can throw 100 exceptions before it barrels over. Is there any thought in terms of where it goes with, well, actually, we can control what things are allowed and aren't allowed? Is that something that maybe looked at in the future?
We have defaults set, and you can actually go change those defaults, and you have to figure out what settings make sense for you.
Yeah.
But a lot of ISVs are also looking at different patterns to kind of work around those settings. For example, I think Todd mentioned JavaScript as a way to call web services
Yeah.
is one way to do it. A lot of people are also looking at the Silverlight pattern.
Sure.
Where-
Silverlight's powerful in a
Yeah.
sandbox.
So in a sandbox, you have Silverlight, you deploy a Silverlight solution, package up as WSP, and then your Silverlight is running on your client machine. So you're not really using the resources
'Cause you're using the
on your
client
server
object
because you're
model.
using the client object model.
Yeah.
So again, there are ways, I'm looking at ISVs that are building around the sandbox
Yep.
and still keeping in the spirit of a sandbox, that they're not impacting
Yeah.
the server farm.
And some of the other discussions being had in the community internationally was around building the service application layer as well. So consuming that, so putting stuff in the server layer and calling it that way. If there is limitations of the client object.
Well, of course, there is the proxy.
Yes,
So
that's
if you
right.
do have the luxury of a non-sort of multi-tenant kind of an environment where I get to deploy some farm solutions and some sandbox solutions,
Yes.
I could deploy those really challenging things that you can't do, like load control and other things that must be done in a full trust kind of an environment as a sandbox proxy, and then call that from your proxy. But that means that I have to have both. I know some corporations can only do sandbox solutions. They can't do any farm solutions at all.
Right, okay.
What I would like to see is I would like to see some set of sandbox proxy capabilities to be packaged and somehow deployed that all of the typical players would deploy, so that we would have those additional functionalities, those things that are really common that everybody kind of needs to be able to do.
And is that where the patterns and practices group, I mean, there's been some releases already, which has been brilliant considering the product's only just been launched, but there wasn't very much on the sandbox solutions with that regard, and it would be nice if there was maybe even some of the solution developers pre-baked so that people could use those. Is that coming? Is that?
Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of guidance around Sandbox come over time.
Yeah.
Sandbox for 2010 is new.
Yeah, that's right.
So best practices will evolve.
Of course,
it's tough
right,
to say it's a best practice at RTM.
Yeah.
Whereas the other patterns have been there since 2007. So you'll see that evolve quite a bit. I think the proxy example where you can put trusted DLLs and actually have it do interesting things like call Azure or some other service out there gives you a lot more flexibility where, for example, you can build a front end in your sandbox, whether Silverlight or otherwise, and then do some of your processing off server or off your sandbox, which could be Azure, it could be something else.
Right.
And I think that's a pattern that is not only relevant for Sandbox, but actually a pattern we're seeing in the industry as well.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of people are doing the client plus services type approach, and I think that's one that might be very popular.
What about the flip side of, so certainly there are advantages to some organizations about deploying the sandbox to the site collections, but could, also on the other side, could you see for some companies that being a burden from an IT perspective and management, right? Because now you have lots of moving parts. And so that's, I was thinking about that when you were talking about trying to start every solution as a sandbox solution, because it would seem to me that there might be some cases where you knew the functionality you wanted to implement would be shared across many site collections. For example, a large document repository. So would you be better off in that case choosing to go with the farm solution because you have a single moving piece, right? And then you deploy it once, you manage it once, versus having to deploy it to all the site collections.
But you're talking about deployment versus development.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're developing, you should be using a sandbox just because it's faster, if for no other reason, right?
Sure.
The iterative deployment on my own dev box is much quicker with no IIS reset, right? So.
Okay.
So if you can live in that sandbox, then it's nice. You can still deploy as a farm, right? So you're not stuck.
Oh, I see. Sure.
You can have a single moving part if you'd like.
Yeah.
That is a big concern of mine, though, is upgradability has been a challenge from my perspective.
Yeah.
I'm going to end up with some sandbox solutions that are upgraded to version 4 and another site collection that only has version 2. And it's difficult in the sandbox itself. Of course, it's a 1.0 release, right? But I can have multiple copies of the same sandbox, and the users can actually upgrade to an older version if they're not careful.
Yeah. Okay.
So we got to really do some good end user
governance
education
around it.
and make sure that they understand how to do the upgrades themselves. But that's no different than just making sure the users understand how to use a product in any general sense.
I mean, it's just a SharePoint list they're going into, in effect. So technically, there could be some add-ons that come along pretty quick from the community. A bit like what Chris O'Brien's done with the feature upgrading stuff.
Yep, agreed. Yep, same basic premise.
Yeah.
But we need that for solution upgrades as well.
Yeah, and I guess PowerShell is the answer for all this stuff from where you're coming from in terms of updating the sandboxes across site collections.
PowerShell is the answer for everything.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
It's also going to be the most common reason that farms are destroyed. Yes.
Actually, the pattern that you mentioned where you could have a singleton or one place for data, and then you could have different instances. I think Todd's absolutely right. You can develop it as sandbox, and if you fall off, if you need more, then you can actually change it. That's easier to do than vice versa.
Yeah.
But there, your deployment could be you deploy one asset, right? Let's say it's a document library, it's something else, the central storage as a farm solution.
Yeah.
And then you can have different light ups, which is either UI or business logic that's managed by a site collection admin.
Gotcha.
So, and I think a lot of different patterns will emerge. It comes back to that whole, your service, let's say you're calling into, I talk about Azure, it could be anything. You're calling into Azure, kind of the service app model.
Yep.
You just explained a data app model, like where your data is centrally stored.
Sure, sure.
And I think it also brings up philosophical questions in general, which is probably out of the scope of this sandbox or scope of this discussion.
The sandbox, so to speak.
There's a philosophical question of how much code you run on the web server front ends in general, right? In a kind of an interesting way, a sandbox kind of limits you from kind of bringing down, like putting a lot of resources, where something that should be a service app is actually running on a web server front end.
Sure.
So it'll be interesting to see how things develop.
And I think a lot of it's going to push a lot more of us to develop in the client side as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the client OM kind of supplements the sandbox thing
It does.
more,
Yeah.
and so does the Silverlight integration too. So I think a lot more of the server development, which we're used to at the minute, will start moving towards the client as people get more comfortable with running JavaScript and in the Silverlight APIs like that.
But earlier, Jeremy, you and I had a discussion, and I can't remember who the other person was that was there. I think it was you, right? So where we were talking about the fact that today the resource monitors are for the site collection, not for a given solution.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually a difficult thing, because if my sandbox solution is behaving and somebody else's is going wild, then you're going to shut mine off right alongside of theirs. It'd be nice if we could actually make that sort of
and even if,
solution by solution
and
based.
even if you pull it back again, is with the conference when they kind of talked about that. The first thing I thought is it's just going to be a war between the administrators and developers in terms of, well, I can see here that this resource on your WSP is going nuts. And
So flip up my number of my units so that I get 600 instead of 300, right?
There's going to be a lot of discussion around that, and I think the first time you deploy something, you won't have an indication of how many resource points you may be consuming. So there's one which is around database query fetches. Now, as a developer in my development environment, I can quite happily say, well, it's going to be this many resources I'm going to consume. But once you've got 250,000 users pulling down that and consuming that sandbox solution, you're really guessing at the figures that are going to happen. So I think that's going to cause a lot of kind of discussion, and that's where the guidance, I think, will reflect that.
But I do think that hopefully there's a way in the future that we can somehow sort of say this sandbox solution gets this many points and this sandbox solution gets another set of points, and they're sort of, mine doesn't shut off just because this guy's misbehaving.
Because your pretty code's fine and another one is...
That's right. Mine didn't blow that resource unit allocation right.
We will publish guidelines, but there are a number of things, like I think someone said you can do anything in PowerShell. There are things you can actually control in PowerShell that you don't do through the web interface.
Sure.
That actually allows you to control certain parameters a little bit more.
Each one of the 14 different consumption points, right? The resource points.
And there are some heuristics that SharePoint uses that are pretty clever, where if there is a bad solution, it actually shuts that solution down, so you don't keep having a situation where that solution eats up all the resources.
Yeah.
And I know we'll be publishing those guidelines because, boy, like SharePoint Online is one of the biggest deployments of SharePoint, period.
Sure.
So as we go ahead and deploy that, we'll publish it so enterprises and people can actually see how we're sending this.
The other thing I think would be really nice is if we could get those same set of monitoring characteristics for farm solutions. Right, because we currently only have
already had that request.
Sandbox solutions, right? It'd be great if we could see that same
I
stuff.
think that's why a lot of people are going to move Sandbox, so they can actually get that feedback on how their solutions are running.
Yep.
Because you go into UAT environment, you can deploy it as a sandbox and start seeing what kind of resources you're consuming.
I mean, you have the developer dashboard just for diagnostics.
That's true.
purposes.
Yes.
Correct. Yes.
So there is some insight.
But that's if
It's a
you're
little
using it as opposed to kind of over time being
Yeah,
able to see
absolutely.
Well, and the developer dashboard is really for this page rather than for this solution and what is it consuming.
Absolutely.
workflows and different things.
Right. I do think that just as a general topic, Sandbox Solutions has radically changed the possibilities that come toward the SharePoint platform's way, right? So I can see a future where we could have a set of Sandbox Solutions that are available to corporations all over the world, much like an app store, like an iTunes or some kind of
so Coplex on steroids,
right? That we could make available, and then people could go and find those things, and we could make available our solutions directly to them through some kind of a channel.
The other interesting thing is the Sandbox. Clearly, it's a great way to go ahead and upload some partially trusted code, but it also provides a way to very easily share declarative solutions.
Yep.
I think that that's kind of one of the elephants in the room where, boy, if you created a nice site or workflow or something like that, it just provides a really easy way to share it.
Just to push it around.
Right? You save it as a WSP, and then you can actually upload it to your site, where there's no real easy way to do that today, where you can create a generic solution and actually go ahead and push it to different people.
Mhm.
Yep.
So that could be really popular as well, and I think time will tell.
Yeah,
in terms of-
I can see a huge future for that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's easy, and sometimes we think of all the. We generally, all of us as human beings, try to think of all the things you can't do and all the things we're used to doing. But sometimes the beauty is in the fact that all the simple things become even easier.
Great. Well, I think we covered all the questions that we had. Does anyone else have any questions for Arpan around this, or was that pretty much?
So when is SharePoint 15 going to launch?
and the plans for
Let the man have a
the
break.
solutions in 15.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would
Sample.
clarify, it's funny. A lot of us here talk in code. SharePoint 15 is the next version of SharePoint, not SharePoint in 2015.
Oh, correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
that's
There are a
right.
lot of people who are like, someone
I should have
today-
said SharePoint vNext.
VNext,
That would've got
there
it.
you go.
Yes.
VNext. Yeah, it's a little too early. I think we're
No doubt.
I think we're just excited about 2010.
What's going on?
Yeah.
But I think we've all been working with it so long now, we forget that the 16th was the general availability date. So
Yeah, that's right.
Some people have seen this for the first time, whereas we've been talking about this for so long now. And it's like, yeah, we've seen those intro slides in the keynote 50,000 times already. It's that kind of.
But it is still exciting, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I
that's
think
right.
that the
Really is,
capabilities that we
yeah.
have in the 2010 platform really are fabulous for us to, as devs, to
Yeah.
supplement what the end user can now use to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. Right?
I can't wait to see what people do with it. That's the key.
Yeah,
When people get
it's
to the
gonna
point
be
of showcasing in the 2011 conference, I'm really looking forward to seeing what people have been doing with it.
As an IT pro, I'm really looking forward to seeing this go into hosting platforms everywhere, because I think straight away this is going to answer one of those age-old questions, which is developer versus the IT pro. Which is just, it's been out there for years. I mean, I can think of several. As soon as .NET came out, there were those problems
Yeah.
immediately where you had partially trusted solutions going in. Just in terms of resource sharing, this is going to be incredible.
And I think it's unique because the value proposition crosses not just developers and IT pros, but end users as well.
Yeah.
So it really is a win-win-win
Right.
for,
Yeah.
for everyone, where IT feels safe about it, developers can get it deployed, and end users can use it. So
Yeah.
it's a
And
That's great.
developers like Jeremy need to learn to fix up their code.
Thanks a lot.
No worries.
For only 300 units, that's all you get.
Yeah, that's right. And if you go over it, too bad.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks for everyone's time anyway, Arpan, and have a nice time in Sydney while you're here doing the touristy bit this week.
Thank you.
We'll catch up with you soon.
Sounds good.
Cheers, Arpan.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much for taking the time to view this webcast. Please bear in mind that you can subscribe to an iTunes or an RSS feed to be able to pick these things up more frequently. I encourage you to check back on the SharePoint Dev Wiki because I will be doing a lot more of these in the future.